Thanks, everyone. I'm Lori Scott, and I'm really pleased to introduce you to NatureServe, which is a nonprofit that I'm going to guess many of you have not heard of. So I'm hoping by the end of this talk you'll have a new appreciation for the work that we do and have some access to resources that are all publicly available if you want to get curious and learn more about the places where you live, and in particular what biodiversity occurs there. So we are a network, and we work with partners in all of the places shown in green on this map. And we've been doing this work for more than 40 years. And over 80 programs combine information with us on over 70,000 species and over 1,600 ecosystems. And together we represent over 1,000 biologists and information technologists who document this information with great detail, and we can aggregate it up and do a lot of analysis and informed decision-making from the very local scale to international scales. Together, our databases respond to more than 6 million information requests a year, so we're not quite hitting the breastcancer.org numbers, but that's okay. Every little bit counts. So how does NatureServe work? Well, across this network, as I mentioned, we have field biologists with expertise in their local regions, and they're out in the field documenting rare species and ecosystems. And together, we collect this information and roll it up and transform it into all kinds of knowledge products and visualizations, which can really guide decision making. So we provide at NatureServe a service of quality control, aggregation, harmonization, because the data could be collected at different scales or sometimes could be misidentified. So we do add that layer of quality control on top so that decision makers can be reassured and have confidence that the information they're accessing from NatureServe is really top notch. The kinds of questions this data are able to answer, we focus on the basics. What exists? Where do you find it? And how is it doing? And we do this to sort of triage where should we focus attention and resources. So we really do try to identify those species that are most imperiled and then target resources towards protection of the habitats where those species occur and put in place protective measures. The clients we serve are very diverse, but we could organize them into these 4 categories, these 4 generalizations. So those include conservation professionals from land management agencies. We do a lot of work with federal agencies like the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, EPA, Bureau of Land Management. We also work with industry and agencies who are on the sort of regulatory side of this equation and trying to comply with those regulations. And also sustainability professionals, whether they're from philanthropic foundations or corporations who are doing due diligence and trying to make sure their business practices are sustainable and good for the environment. And lastly, researchers, university students, citizen scientists, which is increasingly a new source of information about biodiversity, as everyone has a smartphone generally in their pocket, and it's got a sensor, and you can take a photo and you can submit it to an app like eBird and submit your sightings and contribute it into the database about biodiversity. So the kind of information we aggregate and present, this is an example shown here, looking at what are the conservation statuses of the different species in the U.S. and how many of those species are at risk. So if you notice on the chart, birds and mammals are near the bottom in terms of the proportion of those taxonomic groups that are at risk. And as you go towards the top, you see a trend that, by and large, all of the groups of species that are most at risk include those that depend on fresh water. So we see freshwater mussels, we see crayfish, amphibians, freshwater fishes. There's a reason for that, and you've probably seen there's a risk to our waterways as we develop and more runoff and pollution goes into the waterways, or the droughts that we're experiencing. So this kind of data and analysis and visualization can really shine a spotlight on where to invest in the most protection. Here's an example of the spatial data that we collect. So I mentioned there are over 1,000 biologists and information managers working across the country. And we have programs in the US and Canada, so this is a North America view of that rolled up data and a zoomed in example of the very precise locations that we've mapped of at-risk species. And this map can guide decision making and regulatory decisions about whether a project could occur in a given place if there is something at risk to be worried about. So this map represents species locations. And here's a map showing a different view of the landscape. These are terrestrial ecosystem types. So essentially groups of vegetation that come together, and you can see the patterns across the country going from the east where it's very moist, and traditionally we had all these forests, and you go across the plains where we had prairies, and many of that's been converted to agriculture now, and then going across the mountains into the Rockies and into California. So how do we produce a map like this? This is a standardized classification of those ecosystem types. And we start with remotely sensed data, so satellite imagery, and we can classify and write models to sort of match up what we see in the image to signatures of certain vegetation types, and then run that through a lot of algorithms and spatial analysis and get this kind of a map. And we work together with federal partners in a way to standardize the classification of those vegetation types. So we can talk the same language. We can work with each other and know that we're sharing information, and we can be confident that what we label it is something that is a concept that they understand, and vice versa. So we operate with our partners mainly in this Western Hemisphere, but we also feed information up at a global scale. So that map I showed in the last slide, you can see is a pretty fine scale. Each pixel on that map is about 30 meters square. And we have very detailed satellite imagery that we can base that scale of information on. But when we're trying to get a consistent map of what's going on across the whole world, the resolution of the data that's available consistently globally is a little coarser. So in this global map of ecological land units, we have data at about 250 meter square resolution. And what this map represents, these ecological land units, they're very distinct areas where we look at things like the climate, the landform, the lithology, and the land cover. So sort of what's going on underneath the soil, what's going on above the soil, and the atmosphere. And we look at all the combinations that exist, and we come up with about 3,600 unique classes that we can make this beautiful map of the globe. And the data where I'm showing you maps and visualizations, I'm putting a URL on there, and you can go and access a lot more information online and even explore these maps through viewers if you'd like to. I'd like to show you an example of a similar global map, but this one is of marine units. So here we've taken a third dimension because we're talking about the ocean and we've got depth. And so this analysis combined 52 million points and global measurements of 6 different variables over a 50-year period to characterize what's going on in the ocean from the floor to the surface, combining things like salinity and temperature and the sedimentation that's on the ocean floor. So we end up with this beautiful visualization of data and a map that characterizes the global ocean at these different dimensions. About 27 by 27 kilometers is what each point on this map represents. So now I'm going to introduce you to some examples of how these data are being applied to conservation decision making. And I'm going to go through some examples, including how we do map and model the distribution of species based on the known information of where they occur, and then several visualization and decision support tools. So for species modeling and mapping, the challenge can be summed up by looking at these two maps. On the left, we've got a map that's underrepresenting how much of the area is occupied by a species. It can be biased by how intensely we survey for the species and where we happen to look. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It just means you might not have checked yet. The map on the right is over-predicting. It's sort of generalizing based on knowing we found it once in a county. We've turned that county yellow, but that doesn't mean it is happening throughout the county. So we've got two imprecise ways of showing where a species lives on the landscape. So we've taken an approach to model the distribution of species, building a model knowing, okay, what was going on in the environment and the conditions on the land at the places where we know that species occurs. We can look at things like the climate and the vegetation and other variables. And then we can extrapolate and map out all the other places where those same conditions occur and devise, sort of assign probabilities to the likelihood that we would also find the species in those other places. So here's a view of building that type of model where we combine on the left the species occurrence points and we layer in environmental information about the elevation, soil, land cover, climate, and others. And then the map on the right, we end up with a suitability surface where the areas in yellow have the lowest suitability for this species, and the areas in purple have the highest suitability. And then we could set a threshold and pick a probability along that spectrum from 0 to 1 and say, okay, we would set the threshold at, say, 40%, and everything shown in purple here is, in fact, suitable habitat. And where we set that threshold can depend on which question we're asking. So we might set it to be more conservative, we're really, really sure it's there, to maybe opening up that band a little bit to say, well, we really want to cover all of our bases and we want to go looking for the species and we don't want to miss it. So let me run you through an example of how we would apply this kind of information in the real world. We have the Endangered Species Act, which was passed in the 1970s, and that affords legal protection for the most imperiled species. And the Carner blue butterfly is one such species that's listed endangered. And the map on the left is showing areas in bright green where our network has documented occurrences of that butterfly. The sort of orange large map in the background is a map that's in the Fish and Wildlife Service's database when a consultation is done for potentially impacting that species. So it's overrepresented based on counties of potential occurrence. And then the dark green areas are orchards where they might want to apply pesticides, but they don't want to apply pesticides where they would harm that butterfly. So applying that modeling technique, you can see on the right, we've really narrowed down the range in that orange area of the most suitable habitat for the butterfly. And then applying that threshold, you can see, the most suitable habitat for the Carner blue. And they can see that the areas of potential conflict between the butterfly's suitable habitat and the orchards is much smaller than that orange polygon would imply. So we can really guide pesticide consultation process and the Endangered Species Act process with much finer scale data. And our initiative at NatureServe would be to have this kind of model information for every listed endangered species throughout the country so that decision making can be much more streamlined and effective. So switching gears, I have another application I want to show you. So NatureServe has worked with our partners in the state agencies to develop an application to help streamline the environmental review process. So that example I just showed of the butterfly, states have regulations in place to safeguard species being impacted by certain projects. And the legislation can vary in state to state, but we've designed an application that can be customized to really suit the rules in place at a given state and customize it to the workflow. And in this example, we've built this for 8 states now, and one of them is Pennsylvania. So you can visit this site. It's called Conservation Explorer. And you can use it for free. You can make maps. But someone who's submitting a project and wants to sort of get it through the permitting process, this is their first step to say, are there potential impacts at the place you want to do your project for that type of project with any endangered species? So it really streamlines that process. So the approach in the back end of this technology is we've got an online mapping platform, and we've configured the tool to really customize it to that state-specific process in place. So what the agency review workflow is, the natural resource layers that you want to consult to see if the project intersects, can be very finely tuned to different specific project types. And you can have automation of those decision rules that the agency reviewer would be making in their head. You can kind of, as much as possible, automate the very simple decisions, and then allow the reviewers to spend time only on the maybe more complicated cases. So there's a GIS, if you've heard of Geographic Information Systems, that runs in the background, a geoprocess that automates this whole workflow. This is an example of the Pennsylvania Conservation Explorer application. There are many layers you can turn on and off, and as again, you can submit your project application, and you get a result back. So this is just the first page of that response that summarizes the results. And in Pennsylvania, there are multiple agencies that are being consulted in this kind of an application process, ranging from the Game Commission, Fish and Boat Commission, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All could weigh in depending on what resources might occur at that project area. The next application I want to show is called Landscope America. And the challenge this application is designed to support is recognizing that we're really sprawling out across the landscape at a high rate. We're developing a lot of land. In fact, the statistics I had from about 5 years ago were 2 million acres of open space being lost every year. That's 6,000 acres per day across the country, varying intensity at different places. One thing we noticed at NatureServe, because we're looking out for rare species, is that more than 500 imperiled species are found only in some of the fastest growing metro areas. So they're particularly vulnerable to this land conversion. So there's an urgency to act to at least try and guide that land development to the places that would have less impact, and try to accelerate land conservation efforts of putting parks or other conservation easements in place for places where you want to minimize that impact. So this site was designed to build awareness and support that land protection activity, supporting groups like land trusts, for example, with information that could really make some of those decisions more strategic. So the approach to building this tool included working outside of NatureServe's traditional space of just biodiversity, and working with hundreds of other partners so that we could document in the map areas that represent important landscape values, not just for species, but also for recreation and scenic qualities, cultural and historic resources, working lands, protected lands. People want to protect the land around them for a variety of reasons, and we wanted to represent on the map a lot of different landscape values. Our visualization platform brings all those hundreds of layers together. They're organized by theme, so you can view different conservation priorities or recreation layers or layers that focus on plants and animals. You can make your own map. You can share your map. This is freely available. You can also run map reports to analyze your area. The site also includes state portals, so states can customize the homepage for, say, Landscope Pennsylvania to really highlight the conservation priorities and partnerships that are working in Pennsylvania. And it can guide, these portals can guide users to save interactive maps to sort of jumpstart your exploration. I want to share a success story of how Landscope is being used in the Chesapeake. So the policy driver for Landscope in the Chesapeake started with a 2009 executive order that was issued to protect and restore the Chesapeake Bay. So that kicked off a coordination effort among federal agencies, state agencies from all the 6 states that intersect with the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That includes New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. And it resulted in a strategy for how all these agencies would work together, which included having a shared GIS system, a mapping tool, so that all the information that they want to use to guide their decisions on which lands to protect, which restoration initiatives to invest in, could be better coordinated. And we worked with them to make sure Landscope supported that. One thing that's really helped the success of Landscope in the Chesapeake is that there's a formal coalition called the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership. NatureServe is a member, as are those federal and state agencies and other nonprofits. And it's really coordinated the effort of more than 50 organizations. And it meets every year. I've gone to those meetings since 2009. And it helps them really coalesce around those shared priorities that represent everyone's values across the watershed, a very diverse area with tens of millions of people who live here. And in Landscope, the information that's conveyed goes beyond maps. So it's really trying to both inform and inspire land conservation efforts. So a place like the Chesapeake can feature those special places. One such example is the journey through hallowed ground. I don't know if you've heard of that term before, but it represents a stretch of the landscape from the south, starting at Monticello and going up to the north in Gettysburg. And there's a scenic byway, Route 15, that runs that whole area. And there are many rural towns and historic sites throughout that region, many Civil War battlefields, a lot of history, a lot of pride in the local rural landscape. And the towns wanted to really rally together and help promote tourism and drive the economy through people coming to visit and experience that place, not necessarily by turning it into, you know, more housing and shopping complexes. And you can add maps and photos and videos to the map to really help bring these places to life. So really telling a story with a map. So my last example takes us up all the way up to the global scale. And the challenge that this visualization and decision support tool is designed to address is really trying to help people visualize global biodiversity patterns. So worldwide, billions of dollars get spent every year on conservation actions. But it's sometimes difficult to know whether those actions are successful and whether the pressures those actions are meant to suppress are really having a difference on biodiversity. So we worked with the MacArthur Foundation, who's a conservation investor who writes grants to try and improve the conditions in biodiversity and human communities in 3 global hotspots to try and track whether the status and trends of biodiversity are improving or holding steady or declining in these areas. And also to communicate progress toward global biodiversity targets. There was a convention on biological diversity. You've maybe heard of the global conventions on climate change that bring governments together to collectively assign targets to prevent, more increases in climate change. There's a similar convention on biodiversity. And I regret to say the United States is not one of the countries that signed that convention, but most of the countries did. And we're trying to help countries measure their progress against those targets to see if collectively the world's actions are having a difference. So the approach to this tool also includes bringing data together from a number of partners. And we're developing indicators. So an indicator might be a data set that's derived from other data. We want verifiable data. We want data that can help us measure change over time. So ideally, we want data that's going to be repeated through different monitoring programs going forward. So we can look at what happened 10 years ago and today and then in another 10 years and really see what those trend lines look like. And we've organized these indicators into a pressure state benefit response framework, where the concept there is that policy responses, such as putting management in place in a protected area that prevents deforestation, could reduce the pressure that deforestation would have on biodiversity, which would do better if the trees were left intact. And that if that enhanced biodiversity is going to deliver more benefits, we can measure the outcome of those benefits. And I'll show you an example of this in the platform. So we organize these indicators, over 26 so far, but we're adding more every year. Organized under that pressure state response benefit framework. You can decide whether you want to display these data at a country scale or across basins to compare different watersheds. So you can kind of look at how things are doing comparatively in two different places, depending on the scale that you want to compare. And you can look at the trend data by clicking on one of those places that's shown in the map. So here's one of those indicator examples. It's called the Ocean Health Index, and it's an indication of marine biodiversity status, and it's showing annual change between 2012 and 2016. And with all these indicators that are showing change, we like to give a very intuitive color difference between the areas. So the areas in bright red are places where the conditions are quickly worsening. And the areas in blue, the conditions are improving. And I've clicked on, in this example, Somalia, which is sort of highlighted there, and the chart pops up and shows that it was in red, so it's in a worsening situation, and it shows you the trend of the data from this indicator between 2012 and 2016. And for each of these indicators, you can click on the question mark to learn more about the data, understand how the indicator was developed, who provided the data, what kind of information does it provide, and to better understand how to use the information that the dashboard includes. And I just want to close with one example of how the MacArthur Foundation is using the dashboard to assess the success of their conservation investments. So I mentioned that they provide grants in 3 different global biodiversity hotspots. The Mekong region is one of those areas, and in particular in Cambodia, they have made a number of investments across a 10-year strategy designed to prevent deforestation in eastern Cambodia. So using the dashboard, we did a counterfactual analysis to understand whether the efforts that the foundation made in those places was making a difference. So we looked at the rates of deforestation in the sites where they invested, so very site-specific, compared to the conditions in the places where they did not invest. And we looked at whether there's sort of a statistical difference in the places where they invested versus where they did not. And we also did factor out other potential influences like population, like the land protection status, whether there are land and mining concessions. And the results do show that, in fact, the areas where MacArthur invested have had, they can say with confidence that their investments were having a positive response in terms of reducing the deforestation and improving the conditions for biodiversity and for the people who rely on the clean drinking water that filters through those forested areas. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of 4 different examples of how our global data on species and ecosystems and other factors involved in conservation and land protection are being used to guide decisions. So with that, I can take questions.
Any questions for Lori? Stand up and tell us your name and then ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm Christina Celestino. I was just wondering, on the second to last slide, you showed the countries where the conditions were worsening. If you have a hypothesis.
This one?
Why? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the indicator brings together information on a number of conditions in the ocean health, and I'm not as detailed on every data so it's an index of a number of different sets of information. I believe a number of those factors would have to do with the fishing regulations in place, would have to do with pollution, would have to do with, you know, population and kind of regulation. So it's going to take in a number of factors and combine it into a weighted score from 0 to 1 and saying, you know, where are things relatively stable or improving or getting worse. So it would be a number of factors, and that metadata link I referenced does go into a greater detail about every different kind of condition that they are measuring to come up with that grouped score. Not trying to dodge the question. Also, just want to fully caveat that I work on the technology side of NatureServe's business, and I'm not on the science team, so I work, all of these work I represented, I'm working closely with our science team who are the experts in the data a little bit more than I am on the bringing it to tools and visualization side.
Other questions?
What are the real threats to biodiversity that you come up with as a result of all this data gathering?
Yeah, land habitat destruction, land conversion is generally the #1 threat. Invasive species are a major threat, both plants and animals, because they can really drastically invade, as the name implies, and disrupt the natural ecosystem, and the native species can get crowded out and outcompeted, and that once they take a foothold, they can be really, really hard to eradicate, and you can spend millions of dollars trying to, and it can be a losing battle. Climate change. We have done analyses across the entire country how much the climate has already been observed to have shifted from the past to today. And then there are these climate projection scenarios, and you can look going into the future at what, you know, might continue to happen in terms of temperature and precipitation changes. And those are altering the systems that are natively there, and we're seeing shifts, you know, and I think everyone's seeing there's sea level rise, there's drought, and there's just other kind of disruptive patterns that are adjusting the vegetation. Animals need some kind of a migration pathway, so there's an interplay between these threats, where if we've developed a lot of infrastructure and bridges and highways and it makes it hard for the animals to move, that can be a risk. The plants have a harder time dispersing and moving and getting up and going to a better climate. It takes more time. So they all of those three and then others come into play.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in the Arctic, and the polar bears are in terrible danger.
They are.
It's all because of the climate change.
I think that was the first species protected under the Endangered Species Act that pointed to climate change as the primary threat for why it was listed. If anyone knows otherwise, you can correct me. I think that's what I remember hearing. And yeah, the changing conditions in terms of the ice and their ability to hunt, and yeah. Yes?
How do you ensure data quality?
How do we ensure data quality? Okay, so one advantage that NatureServe has is I showed at the beginning that we have this network of partners, and we've worked with these partners for over 40 years, and we actually agreed on a common methodology and format for how we collect and store our data. So just having that understanding has been an immense help for having similar data come together and aggregate. And then we have QC practices in place at each state where the person who enters the data has a second person who checks, there's a second separate person who checks it for quality. So data that's entered gets rechecked by another person. And then finally, when we aggregate it at the NatureServe scale, where we bring it all together from many states, we run additional scripts and algorithms, and we have certain differences that we look for where we could flag that these two fields of information are not, they don't compute when we bring it together. So we've got multiple levels of quality checks in place for both the accuracy of the mapping, the accuracy of the tabular fields of data that are entered, and what kind of rolled up assessment scores we assign to biodiversity and whether they're compatible with the underlying data.
I think related to that, what are some of the biggest challenges that you guys do face in terms of aggregating this data and then displaying it in a meaningful way?
So many challenges. The scale of the data, so spatial data has a big footprint and it takes up a lot of storage, and it, as a nonprofit, the technology expense for keeping up with that can be, daunting. And the advances in spatial data means it's just an ever-evolving landscape. So just the pace of technology change, the scale of the data, the storage amount of the data, the speed that our networks need to operate and to share that size data back and forth. Because we've got people in different offices in different parts of the country and the world. So one thing we've done is set up sort of shared storage and shared servers for processing the data so people can remote in from wherever they are and operate on one set of the data versus making copies and proliferating it where they work and then sending it back and forth across limited bandwidth. And then I would say just human capacity. So keeping track of 70,000 species and try to know exactly how they're all doing. It's frankly a job we can't keep up with it. And so I'm pretty excited about the technology advances we're seeing with big data and open data and crowdsourcing to see if we could open up that challenge to invite more capacity to help us keep up with what's been daunting for our professional staff to do with just, the numbers that we have. So I think there's both challenges and opportunities with the new technology that we have.
Other questions? I have a question for you, Lori.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about NatureServe, about who is providing your funding, and then a little bit about the diversity of your staff?
Sure. So NatureServe is a 501c3 nonprofit, and our budget is around $9 million a year. It's been between, say, 8 and 12 on a given year. And we have about 75 staff that work for NatureServe, the nonprofit. And we have about 1,000 staff who contribute across those 80 institutions that are in each state, and province in Canada, and in Latin American countries. The staff include scientists with botany, zoology, and ecology expertise, information management, technology, GIS on the data side of things. And in terms of our funding sources, it can vary from year to year, and this year will be interesting because right now we've had roughly half of our budget from federal grants and contracts and cooperative agreements, because we do, many of these land management agencies and regulatory agencies do rely on our information source. And probably many of you might have taken for granted that this kind of biodiversity inventory is something the government was doing. But in fact, it's been done by a nonprofit. And we started, I should have mentioned, as a product of the Nature Conservancy. So in the 1970s, when they were putting in place their strategy to protect land, they needed more information on which were the most important places to protect, and there wasn't a comprehensive national biodiversity census. So they put in place a mechanism that is today NatureServe, standing up these biodiversity survey centers in every state and then spreading up into Canada and down into Latin America because species migrate. And if you're going to try and protect it, you need to know that you've been protecting where it relies on throughout its life history as it migrates. So that hemisphere-wide approach was really key. And as we left the Nature Conservancy in 2000 and became an independent nonprofit, we're making this available to many other decision makers in all sectors of society. So I'd say about half federal, and then between the other half, we get a number of philanthropic grants from the private sector, from private foundations like MacArthur, some from individual donors, and some from corporate sector.
Thank you, Lori. We have a gift that we'd like to give you.